Andrew from Kensington Wine Market here to tell you about our new Benromach 2005 cask, the first Benromach cask we've bottled as a business from a sherry seasoned cask. All prior of the 6 before it were ex-bourbon, and true to form at Benromach, they only fill first fill casks. So the bourbon ones were all first fill ex-bourbon, and this sherry cask is a first fill sherry Hogshead. What's really exciting about that to me is we're not just talking any old sherry cask. We're talking Gordon MacPhail sherry, which is very cool. I've already put it in the glass just to let it breathe a little bit, see if we can tease a nose out of it. Now, this is an early, I guess, mid-2000s distillation, 18 years old. I believe it's the oldest sherry cask Benromach to come to Canada, possibly to North America, from a single cask. 58.5%. And, we talk with the early 2000s Benromachs, like the 2002, which I've got a bottle of here, and maybe we'll make an appearance towards the end of this tasting. The combination of that gentle smoke, that lush, creamy profile that you get from those Benromach first fill bourbon casks, and the distillate, which becomes very tropical as it ages. Benromach has a long fermentation. They also use a brewer's yeast. And what's really cool about all that is that it creates a very fruity distillate, a very old school style distillate. There's very few distilleries doing that today. There's some new ones that are doing it, but of your established old school distilleries, most of them move to a more modern distiller's yeast. A lot of them shortened their fermentations in the 60s and 70s. And that continued into the 90s and 2000s as the industry was seeking to become more efficient. And the downside of that is, the way I love explaining this to people is, think about your distillate, your whiskey. When you distill your spirit, you're not creating new flavors, you're shaping them. All the flavors that you have really been formed through your fermentation. And if you've got a very fruity beer that you're going to distill into a spirit, that'll carry forward into the spirit. The spirit gets concentrated and shaped. If you have a less fruity spirit, there's going to be less of that there when you go to distillation, and then consequentially when you go through to maturation. So Benromach, in its mid-teens and early 20s, is starting to go really tropical because it has the DNA there that allows it to do it. The bourbon casks, those first fill bourbon casks, give it a very lush, creamy, honeyed, slightly waxy profile, reminiscent of Brora. What I love about some of these mid to late teens sherry cask Benromachs, and I've had the privilege to try a few, is that they seem to go in this more like Springbank long road territory. So you got a nice funkiness to it. The smoke is there, but it's not overpowering. And it's just got this really lovely old school feel, because Gordon MacPhail sherry casks aren't like everyone else's sherry casks. And you might be wondering why I say Gordon MacPhail sherry, because Gordon MacPhail owns Benromach. Scotland's foremost independent bottler, been in business since the 1890s. They bought Benromach in 1993. It had been closed in 1983, was in a very bad shape. Benromach, it took Gordon MacPhail 5 years to get Benromach up and running again. They didn't cut any corners. They wanted to go with an old school style profile, and that means a light peat, roughly 10 to 12 part ppm, I believe, for their standard distillate, although they do a heavily peated one as well. And they do a very small amount of, have done a very small amount of unpeated triple distilled spirit too. So Gordon MacPhail brought it back to life. They didn't cut any corners. They didn't rush it. They took their time. And I think they've created something really remarkable. And that's going to translate into the liquid here that we're going to dive into. I suppose we should maybe dive into that now. So on the nose, you get a nice mix of both sherry and peat right off the bat. I mentioned before that the sherry has a bit of an old school profile, and I think that's true here. The thing that makes Gordon MacPhail sherry casks unique is that they are typically thicker staved and seasoned longer than the industry average. So they're not trying to give you a really thick, goopy, immediate rush of color and flavor. It's more about long-term maturation. It's more about allowing the spirit to continue to evolve, even in a heavily sherried profile whiskey, without completely overwhelming it. And that's why they've been able to mature whiskeys 70, 80 plus years of age, without the spirit being drowned out and without getting too bitter or just too over the top. It's kind of juicy with this nice mix of like chocolate and tobacco. Get some apricot and mango, maybe a bit of like papaya juice. The smoke is clean, it's elegant. The sherry's got a nice touch to it. I'm struggling to tell whether this is a modern style sherry or a more old school style sherry. My first impression on the nose is that this is going more old school style. Regardless, I mean, you can see the color here. It's got some color to it, but it's not overpowering. And I think a big part of that, again, is what they're looking for in their casks. They're not just looking for something that is dark, something that just purely going to sell it based on color. They're going for flavor profile here. Reminds me a little bit of like Fig Newtons. I like to jokingly say before they ruined them by taking out the trans fats, but it's got this nice kind of doughy note mixed with like candied or stewed raisins, dates, figs, some nice dried fruits there. Let's go ahead and give it a taste. Ooh. On the palate, it's got some power. Both the sherry and the peat come surging in. It's not overly tannic, which is nice. The sherry is more a nice mix of dried fruits. So again, the raisins, dates, figs, with some soft leather and soft tobacco. The smoke is in the background there, but it's a very clean profile smoke. It's chewy and thick, 58.5%, 18 years of age from a first fill sherry hogshead. It's becoming juicier. Those softer fruits are starting to come through. I know that Michael Urquhart, who's part of the third generation of the Urquhart family that owned Gordon MacPhail and were around for the revival of Benromach, said that their aim was to try to tie the two spirits together. Even though the new distillate was going to be more old school than perhaps even Benromach when it closed, they found that they managed to get two notes that were in both, chocolate and orange. And that orange note definitely comes through in this, as does that nice soft kind of milk chocolate tone. Let's give it another sip. It's a little funky, a little earthy. I think that's from that Dunnage Warehouse sherry cask maturation. Most of Gordon MacPhail's warehousing is Dunnage. So earthen floor, traditional style. Again, not cutting corners. Like, it'd be much cheaper to build a racked warehouse, but they're prioritizing the old ways of making whiskey, the traditional ways. Their first whiskey that they came out with of the new distillate from the distillery once they revived it was called Traditional. It was a nod to this. It's also, interestingly, one of only two distilleries in the Highlands and Speyside that predominantly produce peated malts. The other being Brora, which has been brought back to life. Ardmore kind of falls into that category, although only for the whiskey that they intend to bottle as single malt. They also produce a fair amount of an unpeated malt called Ardlair, which is mainly traded for blending purposes. But Benromach is unique in that regards, and I think it was a bit of a gamble when Gordon MacPhail reopened the distillery to go the peated route, the traditional route, the way that whiskey was made pre-World War II throughout the Speyside and the Highlands, as opposed to creating a modern unpeated single malt. It was certainly a brave decision at a point when the whiskey industry hadn't even recovered from the collapse that had happened in 1983. So this is a decade later that they bought the distillery. It'd be 5 years further before it was up and running again. And I guess they saw the future in single malts. They made a gamble that there'd be a place in the world for an old school style Speyside single malt with a touch of peat. And man, were they right. So I mentioned before the 2002. I'm not going to open it here because we're here to talk about the 05. But the main difference here, like you can see that nice soft orangey chocolate note coming through in both. The main difference here is in the bourbon casks, you're going to very tropical, creamy, and waxy with clean smoke. Surprisingly, and this is not how I would have thought it, the peat seems a little more robust. Maybe not the smoke, but the earthiness seems a bit more robust from the sherry cask, and that could be coming from the sherry cask itself. The main difference here is both of them have these nice little tropical fruit notes, but this is restrained a little bit by some classic sherry cask profiles like Christmas cake, dried fruits, chocolates, and it's just lovely. And I did say this before, and I think this is a compliment to both. I've found some of these like first fill sherry single casks of Benromach at 15 to 20 years of age are really kind of channeling this Springbank long row vibe. And I think what I'm getting at there is old school traditional style whiskey in old school traditional style casks. And I think that's where that synergy is there. But I think really this is just extremely well made, great value. I don't think there's a lot of distilleries out there that are putting out as good whiskeys as these, 2000s Benromachs, because very few of them have been making them in a really slow, unrushed, traditional way. Final thoughts on that, because I've been rambling a little bit here. I just think it's lovely. The sherry's great. The smoke is there. It's clean and a little earthy. And underneath that, you have a mix of both dried and dark fruits, but also some lush tropical mango, papaya, even a bit of banana in there. So that's our 2005 Benromach. I hope you love it as much as we do. I think it's a fine drop. And until next time, Slange.